minutes later, they reached a slight rise at the edge of town that gave them a good view of the free trading market below. The primitive collection of tents and carts were bordered to the north by the ruins of a large lead-smelting plant, to the west by a spaghetti-like tangle of railroad tracks, and to the east by the great expanse of the Mississippi River. The free trading market was actually a lot larger than it appeared. Many of the more permanent vendors had reclaimed the abandoned boxcars on the railroad tracks and set up shop there. The main hive of shops and vendors were knotted together into lanes on the vast concrete slab that had once served as a loading area for trains and ships. But other vendors, mostly turkey and sheep herders, were spread far to the south, where their animals could drink from a large tributary that curled around the southern edge of old Herculaneum. "Well," said Richardson, pointing down at the bustle of humanity, "there it is. The Herculaneum Free Trading Market."
"Looks like fun,"
Nate said. He caught Avery's eye and gave her a wink. She giggled back at him. Sylvia's expression was hard.
"There's not going to be anything fun about it," she said. "We all need to keep our heads. There's a pretty good chance Ken Stoller has operatives down there. If so, they'll be looking for us. We need to be on the lookout for them."
They headed down a narrow business road toward the market. There were others on the road with them, women mostly, standing in the doorways of the abandoned buildings. One of the women, a girl actually, no more than 16 or 17, who looked like one of those sad-eyed waifs in the old Feed the World posters, leered at them with a crooked, black-toothed smile. She was skinny as a junkie, but her blouse was open far enough to expose most of her small breasts.
"Hey there,"
she called after them.
"You lonely?"
Nate veered toward her. "Hey there yourself," he said.
"What you want, sweetheart?"
the girl said. Before Nate could answer, Richardson grabbed him by the arm and pulled him back toward the middle of the road. "What are you doing?" Richardson snapped.
"What?"
Nate said. He flashed that wide-eyed, innocent smile.
"What did I do wrong?"
"Just cool it, okay? We can't afford to draw attention to ourselves." Sylvia made another angry huff and walked off. Avery was watching the hooker, who was backing away into the shadows, but still smiling at Nate, and her face was a rapidly shifting pattern of emotions: confusion and indignation and jealousy. She ran after Sylvia.
"What was that woman doing?"
Richardson heard her ask. He gave Nate a slap on the shoulder. "Come on." The crowds got thicker as they entered the market. It had been a long while since he'd been around so many people, and Richardson felt his anxiety rising with every passing moment. They brushed against him in a constant shuffle. Vendors bartered with customers, their voices loud, abrasive. A sense of claustrophobia welled up in his chest. He was sweating, breathing fast. He couldn't stop swallowing. And then he saw the soldiers from Ken Stoller's compound. It was a squad of 5. They were dressed in the familiar gray T-shirts and black BDU pants, each of them armed with rifles. Richardson watched the man in charge of the squad, saw his head swiveling as he scanned the crowd. "Sylvia," he said. The soldier's eyes swept over Ben, then came back to him. He squinted at Ben, his mouth turning down at the corners. 3 women carrying chickens and bird cages crossed the path between them, and the soldier craned his neck to look over the women.
"I see them," Sylvia said. "Ben, we have to get out of here."
"Over there," Richardson said, and pushed Sylvia and Avery between a pair of tents. Nate was right behind him. They pushed their way to the back of the tents, where they butted up against a brick wall. There was nowhere to go. "Damn it," he said. He heard a commotion behind them, people being pushed out of the way. "Hey!" said the soldier. He and his squad were working their way back between the tents. "Get out here, now!"
"Ben," Sylvia said, "what'd we do?"
Richardson could hear the soldiers coming. Damn, there wasn't time. "Here," he said, lifting the skirt of a tent. "Get under here."
"What are you going to do, Ben?"
He took a water bottle and splashed some against the brick wall. Then he handed the bottle and his backpack full of weapons to Sylvia. "Just get under there, both of you." "Hey!" the soldier barked again. "Hurry, Sylvia." She and Avery got down on their bellies and worked their way under the tent flap. Nate tapped him on the shoulder and said,
"Dude, here they come."
"Got it. Come on, whip out your dick."
"What?"
"Hurry!" And before Nate could protest further, Richardson unzipped his fly and pulled out his penis and pointed it at the wall. "Do it," he said to Nate. "Come on, hurry!" Nodding slowly, Nate did the same right as the soldiers came around the corner of the tent. "You two," the soldier said. "Turn around. Slowly." "Oh, man," Richardson said, feigning surprise. He turned toward the soldier, still holding his penis in his fingers. "You scared me, man." The soldier, his rifle was leveled at Richardson, glanced down at Richardson's penis, then to the wet spot on the wall. His face wrinkled in disgust. "Ah," he groaned. "Put that away." Richardson did as he was told. "How come you didn't answer me?" the soldier said. "Were you calling me?" Richardson said. "Wow, I'm sorry. I really had to go." He rubbed the hand he'd been holding his dick with on his pants and stuck it out to the soldier. "I'm Ben Richardson," he said. "If you were calling me, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you." The man lowered his rifle. "I'm not shaking your hand," he said. He pushed his way past Richardson and glanced up and down the alley behind the tents. The rest of his squad was waiting in the gap between the tents. "You guys double back," he said to his squad. "Search in between the tents." He turned back to Richardson. "Where are you from?" "Well, gosh, all over," Richardson said, scratching his head. "This is my first time here in Herculaneum, but I've been all over. Mostly I've been up in the Northwest. That's where I met Nate here. We've been going around together about 2 years now." "You talk?" the soldier said to Nate. "He can talk fine," Richardson said. "But most of what he says just tends to get us in trouble where there was no trouble before. You know what I mean? He's got a little problem understanding social cues. It ain't his fault. He fell off a 2-story balcony one night when we almost got cornered by some infected, and he ain't been the same since. We go around together. I watch out for him." The soldier studied them, nodding slowly. And then, much to Richardson's relief, he turned and went back to the crowd at the front of the tents. Watching him go, Richardson let out the breath he was holding. "That was close," he muttered.
"What was that about me falling from a balcony?"
Nate said. "You ever read Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, Nate?"
"Huh?"
Richardson smiled. "Well, that guy hasn't either, apparently. Good thing."
"They gone?"
Richardson glanced down at the tent flap. Sylvia was looking up at him. She looked frightened. "Yeah, they're gone." He knelt down next to her and spoke in a whisper. "Sylvia, this isn't going to work. We're going to have to split up."
"I know. What do you want to do?"
"Nate and I will find us a boat. Can you and Avery make it down to the docks on your own?"
"Yeah, I think so."
"Okay. We'll find somebody. You guys should probably take most of the weapons, too. We need to keep those out of sight. Meet us up at Ferry Street Point."
"Good luck,"
she said. "Yeah, thanks." Nate gawked at all the stuff. He saw vendors with carts full of vegetables and tools and canned goods and jerry cans of gasoline. There were carts loaded down with pornography and dried beef and sacks of flour and nuts and sugar, and even one guy selling marijuana. The smell of it caught Nate like a fishhook in his nose, and he stopped to stare at the buds hanging from the roof of the vendor's cart, mouth agape. The buds were so dark in color they almost looked brown, and they were practically dripping with resin. Some of them were as fat as a leg of mutton. The old hippie behind the cart sat puffing on a small brass pipe, his face wreathed in smoke. He gave Nate a knowing smile and a nod. "Come on," Richardson said, pulling him away by the arm.
"Dude," Nate said, "did you see the size of those buds? I ain't seen weed like that since before the outbreak."
"And what are you going to trade for it?" Richardson said. Nate's smile slid off his face. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Come on." Richardson led him toward the river, and into a maze of tents packed together as densely as a hive. They were interconnected, giving total coverage to the patrons inside, shrouding them in shadows. Right away, Nate could see they were in some kind of bar. A still was cooking off to his right, and the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and wood smoke and stale liquor.
"I don't see any soldiers,"
Nate said. "Shh," Richardson said. "We've been lucky so far. But keep your head on straight, okay? These are rough people. Don't say anything about yourself or what we're doing here. Just try to be invisible."
"You sound like Doc Kellogg."
Richardson gave him a sidelong glance. "Yeah," he said. "Well, it's good advice most of the time. Just watch yourself, okay?" Nate sniffed at the tobacco smoke in the air, his mouth watering. Everywhere he looked, people were smoking and drinking, whispering to each other. They glanced up at him as he and Richardson walked into the tents. "I'm going over there," Richardson said, and pointed to a pair of old, heavy-set women, off at one corner of the tents. "Just try to stay out of trouble, okay?"
"Sure,"
Nate said. He watched Richardson approach the women. Their expressions grew hard as soon as he started speaking, and a moment later one of the women picked up her drink and walked away. The other stayed, though, frowning while she listened. Richardson's advice to try to be invisible felt like a joke to him now that he was on his own. He felt like every eye in the place was watching him. But he tried to look like he belonged as he quietly scanned the crowd. Most had gone back to their conversations, though a few weren't even trying to hide the fact that they were staring at him.
"You're not from around here, are you?"
Startled, Nate turned and saw a girl of about 17 leaning against a counter to his right. She was smiling at him, her dark eyes sparkling with reflected candlelight. Her dress was open at the neck, and he could see right down the front of it.
"Hi,"
he said, his voice cracking as he spoke.
"Jesus," he thought, "she's not wearing a bra."
She didn't say anything. She leaned forward a little more and put her chin in her hand, her elbow on the bar. In the shadows, just beyond her face, Nate could see her hips swishing back and forth.
"What's your name, sweetie?"
"Nate," he said, and swallowed nervously. Her gaze drifted down his frame, then back up to his face. Her expression seemed to suggest that she liked what she saw.
"Where are you from, Nate?"
"Up north," he said. His throat suddenly felt dry. The girl was giving off vibes that he felt down in his groin.
"They have girls up north, Nate?"
"Girls?" he repeated. Then, regaining some of his self-control,
"Yeah, sure, they got girls." "You got a girlfriend?"
"A girl? No," he said, laughing. "I'm a lone wolf, you know." He glanced behind him and saw Richardson sitting on what looked like a roll of carpet, talking in confidential whispers with the older, heavy-set woman. She was smoking a cigar now, not speaking, staring at Richardson through the smoke. When he looked back, the girl had come out from around the corner. She was very close to his right shoulder now, close enough to whisper in his ear.
"A girl gets awful lonely around here, Nate. All these old men. Want to go out back with me and smoke a joint?"
"You bet," he said, wincing at the desperate note of enthusiasm in his voice. She winked at him.
"Follow me, Nate."
She took him by the hand and led him to the back of the maze of tents, where she slipped through the seam.
Come on, Nate.
Her voice was smooth as ice cream. He glanced back at Richardson for just a moment, then at the girl, her breasts rising and falling slightly with each breath, her dress clinging to her erect nipples. He swallowed the lump in his throat and followed her. But no sooner had he made it through the flap when something heavy hit him at the bundle of nerves at the base of his neck. His legs turned to water beneath him, and he slumped to the ground, looking up in shock at the two men who had materialized out of nowhere. He tried to raise a feeble hand to stop the second blow, but it did no good. His vision turned purple, then black. When he came to, there were hands all over him, jerking his body from side to side as they dug into his pockets. "Hey!" he groaned, but he was unable to move. Somebody's knee was in his back. The girl stuck a knife in his face. It was old and rusty, a double-edged stiletto with a handle wrapped up in duct tape. Nate had seen a lot of knives and a lot of hands while living on the road these last 6 years or so, and he doubted she knew how to use it. But of course, that didn't matter. The blade was only inches from his eyes, and he couldn't move his arms. He was a Thanksgiving turkey about to be carved. "Please," he said hoarsely.
"Fuck you, sweetie," she said.
Her teeth were grinding together, her lips flecked with spit. The come-on he had seen in the bar was replaced by viciousness now. She looked like a hungry dog, ready to fight for its dinner. He felt the knife dig into the soft flesh of his cheek, and a scream welled up in his chest. He was about to let it loose when the tent flap behind him snapped open. The two men grunted as they stumbled over Nate. In the confusion, Nate scrambled away from the blade and sat against the tent pole a few feet away. Richardson was standing at the tent flap. One of the men who had jumped Nate climbed to his feet just as Richardson reached into the waistband of his jeans and pulled out a black leather blackjack. The man let out a honking noise like an angry goose as he charged Richardson, but he never finished his attack. Richardson cuffed a backhanded swing across the man's face, catching him in the chin with a noise halfway between a slap and the clink of heavy beer mugs knocking together. The man sank into unconsciousness. The other man watched his partner fall. When he looked back at Richardson, the blackjack was already connecting with his groin. He doubled over with a rush of air, falling to his knees. Richardson followed the blow with a downward slap to the back of the man's head that put him flat on his face. "Fucking asshole!" the girl shouted. She charged Richardson, the knife waving wildly in front of her. It did her no good. Richardson punched her in the face with his blackjack, and she sank to her knees, her hands cupped over the bloody bloom that had been her nose just a moment before. "You fucking bastard!" she said. The blood was pouring out between her fingers, her face ruined. "Shut up, bitch," he hissed, bringing the blackjack down on the side of her ear. Nate watched the girl sink into a heap on top of the tent skirts. He stared at her, then slowly became aware of Richardson standing above him, watching him. And behind Richardson was a heavy-set woman, the same one he'd been speaking to on the opposite side of the bar. She was looking at Nate like he was a dog that had just rolled in something nasty. "Are you okay?" Richardson said. "Huh?" Nate said. Richardson pointed to the side of his head. "Your cheek. You're bleeding there." Nate touched his own face. His fingers came away bloody. "Yeah," he said. "I think." Richardson nodded. "This is Gabby Hinton," he said, pointing to the old woman next to him. "She and her husband own a trawler. I think they might be able to help us."
"That remains to be seen," the woman said.
She turned to leave, spreading the tent flap open.
"You and Odie there want to follow me?"
The Mississippi River moved sluggishly by. Sylvia Carnes and Avery Harper knelt in a stand of tall weeds next to the water, watching the commotion up on the docks. Soldiers from Ken Stoller's compound, men Sylvia had known for years, were patrolling the docks with AR-15s at the ready. She knew they were looking for her, and she knew what would happen if they were found. She pulled Avery close.
"What are we going to do, Sylvia?" "Shh. Just keep quiet."
A man named Justin Roth stopped a few feet from the weeds where the two women were hiding and pulled the walkie-talkie from his belt. "Yeah, this is Squad 9. Go ahead." The voice on the other end was broken, but Sylvia did hear it say something about trouble over at the bar. "Squad 9, copy," said Roth. "We're on the way." Roth motioned to his men, and then to one of the other squad leaders. Stolar's soldiers, most of whom looked bored and itching for a fight, perked up at Roth's command. From the weeds, Sylvia and Avery watched as the men huddled together, and then moved into the middle of the trading center.
"What's going on?"
Avery asked.
"I don't know," Sylvia said, "but I don't like it."
Nate followed along behind Richardson and the old woman, feeling a little numb from his close encounter with death. The way that girl had looked at him, he had no doubt she'd wanted to drive that knife into his eye socket. Even now that the danger was behind him, he could still feel his stomach churning with a charge of adrenaline. He scanned the faces that had just a few minutes earlier looked at him with the unabashed contempt one reserves for the stupid, and was surprised to see that none of them would meet his gaze now. Nate shifted his gaze to the old woman. She wasn't that old, Nate realized, just seemed that way at first glance. He guessed she was probably over 60 or thereabouts. She had large, deeply tanned arms, and a bushy mess of hair that reminded Nate of smoke rising from her head. Her bottom wriggled and shifted beneath her brown linen skirt, but despite her weight and her age, she moved with confidence through the crowd, and as he watched it zipper apart for her, he was reminded of a mama bear herding her cubs.
"That's it,"
he thought, smiling.
"She's Mama Bear."
She led them out of the main section of the bar and into a dark back corner. Nate followed with an odd sense of déjà vu. They saw a man sitting in a cloud of smoke, his white-bearded face illuminated momentarily by the orange glow of a lit joint. Right away, Nate caught the earthy, sweet smell of marijuana. Inhaling deeply, he sat down next to Richardson. Gabby leaned down and gave the old man a kiss. He was older than her, and even more rugged. His beard was bushy and unkempt, his dark eyes lit with the severe confidence of a lifelong sailor. He had both of his huge arms on the table, and to Nate, his fists looked like bricks. "Hello, sugar," he said. He winked at his wife as he gave her a pat on her prodigious butt. She giggled as she slid in next to him.
"Get your mind out of the gutter, you dirty old man. These guys want to talk business."
Right away, the smile faded from his face. He put his joint down and examined Nate and Richardson. "I saw what you did to Mary and her brothers over there," he said to Richardson. "That was good work." Then his gaze shifted to Nate. "You, on the other hand, boy, you ain't got the sense God gave cow shit if you fell for that come-on-in-the-back-with-me routine. It's a wonder you're still alive, you know that?"
Nate said,
fumbling over his words. Richardson came to his rescue. "You have a boat," he said. "That's right," the man said. "I'm Jimmy Hinton. My wife and I are the co-owners of the Sugar Jane. Gabby here tells me you guys want to go downriver."
"We do."
"How far downriver?" "To a little town called Chester. You know it?" "Chester?" Hinton glanced at his wife. "Gabby, I thought you said these guys were serious." "Mr. Richardson, you have any idea what's going on that far downriver? You two ever heard of the Red Man?" "We know about the Red Man," Richardson said. He appeared amused. "Naturally, we want to avoid any contact with him, but we would like you to take us to Chester, and we'd like to leave this afternoon." "Yeah, well, what you need to understand here, Mr. Richardson, is that an emergency on your part doesn't guarantee a sense of urgency on my part.
And it occurs to me that your big challenge right now is to convince me why I need to drop everything I've got going on just to accommodate you.
Nate laughed at the man.
Everything you've got going on? Who are you kidding, guy? From where I'm sitting, it looks like you ain't doing much beyond sitting on your butt getting high. Say that again,
Hinton said, both fists on the table.
You heard me, Nate said,
rising to his feet. Gentlemen, Richardson said. He grabbed Nate by the elbow and pulled him back down to his seat. Nate, please. He turned to Hinton and said, We understand your situation, Mr. Hinton. And you're right. It is a seller's market. He reached down to his packs on the floor and put a long burlap sack on the table in front of Hinton and his wife. The rifles inside the bag clanked heavily.
What's this?
Hinton said. Payment, Richardson answered. Look inside. Richardson waited for Hinton to open the bags. When the man let out an impressed whistle, Richardson said, You can have those 2 now. You can have another 9 when we board your boat.
You have 11 of these things?
Hinton said. His voice dropped uncertainly. That's right. All of them that good. These aren't refit jobs held together with duct tape. They're all military grade.
Military grade,
Hinton repeated dreamily. We have ammunition, too. Hinton let out a laugh. He glanced at his wife, and an entire conversation seemed to pass between them without a single word being spoken.
Okay, Hinton said. We can leave first. Uh-oh.
He nodded toward the opposite side of the bar. Nate and Richardson shifted in their seats. Across the bar, one of Ken Stoller's squads was coming through the crowd. Hinton knocked on the table in front of Nate.
Looks like your little run-in with Mary and her brothers has brought down the law. Me?
Nate protested. But Hinton and his wife weren't listening. They were already rising from their chairs and stepping through a hidden flap behind the table. Where are you going? Richardson said.
To the docks, Hinton said. Let's see, we have our own reasons for not wanting to talk to Ken Stoller's people. We'll meet you at the Sugar Jane in 1 hour. Don't be late.
We'll be there, Richardson said. You can count on us. Hinton cocked an eyebrow at him, and a moment later, he was gone. Chapter 13. Jimmy Hinton and his wife ducked behind a vendor's cart draped with tattered winter coats, and watched one of Ken Stoller's squads run into the bar. There was no mistaking the soldiers' intent. They were looking for somebody, and it didn't look like they were in the mood to do much talking. Stoller's people were no strangers to Herculaneum's free trading market. In the 5 years or so that Hinton and Gabby had been doing business here, he'd come to know Stoller's people all too well. He'd done business with them many times, and on one occasion, fairly recently, lost a large shipment of beef bound for their compound to pirates up near the Iowa border.
Jimmy, Gabby said, we need to go. I know. I wonder what they're doing there, though. They're looking for somebody. Jesus, woman, I can see that.
He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Stoller had always been unpredictable, even when he got his money's worth. But he'd been especially high-strung lately. Same with his troops. Jimmy supposed it was because the Red Man's black shirts had finally broken and defeated the other compounds in the area. That would certainly account for Stoller and his people feeling on the defensive. Everybody was feeling a little bit afraid of the Red Man's growing power in the area. But even still, Stoller's people were behaving more like Nazi stormtroopers than an embattled private security detail. Jimmy sensed restlessness in them. Uncertainty, maybe. Was there some kind of internal trouble in the compound, perhaps? Maybe in light of the Red Man's recent successes and Stoller's seeming inability to stop him, his popularity with his people was waning. Jimmy suspected that was probably the case. And it was bad for business, too. Everybody along the river was starting to notice that. Regardless of what he thought of Stoller and his people, He did have to admit that at least they always demonstrated a pragmatic streak when it came to commerce. They knew to leave this bar alone. It was where all the river business got done. If your cargo needed to go anywhere on the Mississippi, from Memphis to Minneapolis, you arranged for its transport in the bar at Herculaneum. Now the bar, too, seemed to be a victim of Stoller's increasingly questionable leadership. Raiding the place would upset the delicate economy of trust that had grown up among the river pilots who made the place their home base. For Stoller, the effect was like pissing in his own pantry. Nobody would trust him after this.
"I want to go, Jimmy."
"Yeah," he said.
"I think that's a real good idea."
They slipped through the maze of carts and the crowds of dazed people, all of them moving slowly in the heat of midday. In his mind, Hinton ran through the list of supplies they were going to need. It would take 3, possibly 4 days to make the trip, and they still needed canned goods, toilet paper, and an auger to fix the crapper on board the Sugar Jane, which had been stopped up for over a month now. They had less than an hour to get it all done, but they could do it. At least he'd had the forethought to gas up last night. That was going to make things a lot easier.
"This is a good deal for us, right?" "Huh?"
Hinton turned to his wife, the fragility in her expression taking him by surprise. After 46 years of marriage, after having a child together, after losing a child together, losing a grandchild together, after walking hand in hand through the apocalypse together, he had come to look upon her as his rudder. She nursed him when he was sick. She satisfied him when he was drunk and horny. She had once pulled his unconscious body from a burning warehouse down in Bartlett. And after all that, he had almost forgotten that she could, at times, look so fragile.
"Yeah, I think so," he said. "You did good setting this up. 11 military-grade rifles."
He shook his head in wonder, a smile spreading across his face.
"This could be our ticket, Gabby." "You mean it? We could really leave all this? Head down to Mexico? Finally?" "You bet," he said, still smiling. "Tell me again how it'll be, Jimmy." "I already told you," he said. "Tell it again. I like to hear you tell it. Tell me about the island with the sand so white it looks like salt, and the fruit hanging off the trees, and the fish so big and dumb they jump right in the boat. You don't even need to put your hook in the water." "Yes," she said breathlessly. She took his hand in hers and squeezed it. "Tell it to me again, please." "Okay," he said. "Jesus, woman, the things you put me through." It had been 6 years since they'd lost their only daughter, Eileen, and her daughter, Sarah, to a zombie attack in Sarasota, Florida. After that, Jimmy and Gabby had taken their trawler, the Sugar Jane, and gone cruising, always staying one step ahead of the zombie hordes, and finally settling here on the Mississippi. For 5 years they'd lived as river Bedouins, hauling pick-me-up cargo up and down the river in a never-ending loop. In many ways, their marriage had taken on the same kind of circularity. They were both running from their memories of the past, never staying in one place long enough for the images of what they'd lost to catch up with them. They floated up and down the Mississippi, Jimmy telling Gabby about the island to which they would one day run. They would settle there, eating fruit from the trees, drinking booze with their toes buried in the white sand, eating pan-seared red snapper by a campfire at night. He told the story so many times that he could picture that dream island down off the Mexican coast as clearly as he could remember the way his granddaughter had squeezed his finger when she took her first steps. But like that memory, the island had always seemed like it belonged to another time, one that he and Gabby would never live to see. The 11 military-grade weapons would change that. They could trade those guns for everything they'd need to make the trip down to the wild zones of old Mexico. It might actually be happening for them. Finally, after all these years, after all they'd been through together. And it was then, as they walked through the market toward the docks,
and as Jimmy began reciting, yet again, his description of the island, that he suddenly realized the fragility he had seen on Gabby's face just moments before was actually the fragility of a cherished dream birthing itself into reality. She was scared to let it see the light of day, for it was all that sustained her in this ruined world. If it died, so would she, and so would he.
"Hello there, Jimmy Hinton. Where are you guys going?"
A tall, bow-legged soldier stood in front of him. His name was Justin Roth, livestock manager for Ken Stoller's compound, and now, apparently, a squad leader. The other men, all dressed in the Union Field gray and black uniforms, stood by looking smug.
"Hello, Justin."
Justin Roth raised a rifle at Jimmy's midsection. Behind him, his squad did the same.
"You have a lot of nerve showing yourself around here, Hinton."
"It's a free trade market, isn't it?"
Jimmy replied, trying to sound unconcerned and not totally succeeding. His gaze darted across the surrounding maze of carts and the crowd of people milling about. He saw several other squads of soldiers searching the area. They could run for it, Jimmy thought, but they wouldn't get far. "You owe Union Field 6,000 pounds of beef, Hinton. It won't be a free market for you until you've paid that back. Now get your hands up." Jimmy did as he was told. He raised his hands up around his shoulders, at the same time taking a barely perceptible half-step in front of Gabby.
"What are you planning on doing, Justin?"
Jimmy could feel Gabby's hand inching down his back, then pulling the tiny metal canister from the waistband of his slacks. "I'm going to drag your sorry pot-smoking ass to Ken Stoller. What he's going to do with you I can't say, but I can promise you that it is going to be a rough ride for you getting there. You might just fall down a few times, if you know what I mean." A hard-edged smile played at the corner of the cowboy's mouth, exposing his tobacco-stained teeth. "Yeah, I think I get you loud and clear," said Jimmy. "Gabby, what do you think?"
"Loud and clear," she said,
stepping around from behind Jimmy with the metal canister raised high. She pulled the trigger on the head of the canister, and it let out a liquid spray of oleoresin capsicum. Justin Roth and his squad flinched as the pepper spray hit their faces, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. But then, suddenly, the air seemed to catch fire. Roth and his soldiers dug their fists into their eyes. They were screaming. A few of them doubled over, coughing. Gabby pulled Jimmy back into the startled crowd. He too could feel the pepper spray burning the back of his throat.
"We gotta move," she said,
and before they turned and ran, she sprayed the remainder of the canister into the crowd. Angry yells rose up all around them. People elbowed each other, trampled one another in a mad dash to vacate the area. The scene was complete confusion. Carts were upended. People were yelling, fighting, scrambling to scoop up their belongings amid the rush of bodies. Through the panic, Jimmy could see other squads of soldiers turning their heads toward the outburst. A few were already running.
"This way,"
Gabby said, pulling him through the crowd. He tightened his grip on her hand and let her lead him. They ran with the crowd, slowing to a walk only when they encountered people who were facing the direction from which the couple had just come. Jimmy glanced left, then right. Stoller's soldiers were everywhere.
"Jimmy, there,"
said Gabby, pulling at his sleeve.
"You see it?"
She was pointing at a man who was trying to guide a flock of sheep away from the turmoil. The big dumb animals were bleating irritably, but reluctantly obeying their shepherds, pushing and prodding. Gabby ran for the flock, and before Jimmy had a solid idea of what she had in mind, she was ducking down onto all fours and crawling into the middle of the flock. He shook his head, laughing. "God, I love that woman." And then he jumped down onto all fours and crawled after her. Watching Nate gawk at the vendors and the hookers and the crowds of people, Richardson had to laugh. The man was acting like they'd landed on Sunset Strip back in its heyday, instead of some run-down flea market at the edge of a dead world. Nate's reaction was humorous to watch, but also a little sad once Richardson really thought about it. This is what they had been reduced to. Places like Herculaneum had become their Mecca, their temples. Good God, he thought. Have we really fallen so far as all that, where even our dreams are small? Keep an eye out for the girls, Richardson said, adjusting the pair of packs on his shoulders. The rifles and the ammunition were surprisingly heavy when you had to carry them all day. Nate chuckled.
Dude, I see a couple of them right now.
They were almost to the docks, where 10 battered trawlers rocked gently in the river's current. Richardson looked back at Nate and saw him waving to a pair of rough-looking women, whose occupation was obvious at a glance. Seriously? Richardson said. After what just happened, you haven't learned your lesson?
What?
Nate said. His smile was huge. He was really enjoying this.
You know how long it's been since I got laid?
No idea, Richardson muttered, and thought, and I don't care, so please don't tell me, even though I know you're about to.
Yeah, well, I don't know either. And, brother, that's too long.
Richardson smiled perfunctorily at him, then went back to scanning the riverbank, hoping to catch some sight of Sylvia Carnes and Avery Hopper. The market thinned out quite a bit this close to the docks. He saw a few vegetable stands and the occasional flock of turkeys or sheep or goats, but no sign of the women. He was worried about the squad of soldiers from Ken Stoller's compound who were standing on the dock, but he and Nate had bought the women a change of clothes that he hoped would make it easier for them to sneak on board the Sugar Jane. They'd play it by ear, adjust as needed.
How long has it been for you?
Nate said.
Huh? How long has it been since you know?
Nate clicked his tongue suggestively. Richardson rolled his eyes. He had no desire to fill Nate in on the details of his sex life, just as he had no desire to think of how little there was of it to tell about. The last sexual encounter he'd had was in the winter, 3 years earlier. He'd been sleeping in a tent next to a road outside of Laramie, Nebraska, a foot of snow on the ground outside. A woman had come along. She was too skinny, too hungry-looking to be attractive, but she needed shelter and food, and Richardson had enough of both to spare. He let her stay, and they slept side by side in his sleeping bag, cuddling each other, not for the thrill of it, but for warmth. Richardson had gone straight to sleep, not expecting the woman to give up anything in exchange for his kindness. But he woke up with her stroking his cock with her hand, tugging on him until he came. It had been an empty, pathetic scene, devoid of passion. He hadn't made a sound. They hadn't even kissed. He never knew her name.
That long, huh?
Nate said. What? Ben said. Nate smiled and shook his head.
Say, what do you think about Avery Hopper? She got a little meat on her, I know, but she seems pretty cool. I wonder if she's got a boyfriend back at that compound she's from.
I doubt it, Richardson said.
She told you that?
No, Nate. She didn't say a word to me about it. But seeing as all these soldiers around here are trying to kill her, I doubt she has anyone back at the compound anymore. Know what I mean? Nate nodded, the smile leaving his face.
Yeah, he said. I think I got you.
They found Sylvia and Avery hiding behind a row of wrecked cars that had been there so long that weeds were growing up around the wheels and through the empty engine compartments. Richardson gave them the clothes he'd found for them, and he and Nate waited while the women crawled inside one of the wrecked cars and changed. When they came out, Richardson told them about the boat he'd chartered.
Hinton and his wife, Sylvia said. Do you think we can trust them?
I think so. The wife seemed to have a pretty good head on her shoulders, and I got the feeling they weren't any more eager to meet up with Ken Stoller's soldiers than we are. That's their boat right over there, the white one at Slip 6. It's called the Sugar Jane. She nodded. The ponytail between her shoulders looked as lively as a squirrel back there, and he frowned, looking at it.
"What is it?" she asked.
"Your hair."
The clothes he'd obtained for them managed to change their appearance somewhat, but that head of frizzy gray hair of hers was going to give them away for sure if any of Stoller's soldiers got close. And they still had to get past the squad stationed at the entrance to the docks.
"Have you ever thought of cutting it? I mean, really short?"
"Cut my hair?" she said.
She looked momentarily horrified. But she didn't get to finish the rest of it. Before she could say anything else, they heard a lot of yelling coming from the edge of the market. The soldiers, who had been lounging around the entry to the docks, sprinted toward the disturbance.
"That doesn't look good,"
Nate said. They heard 2 shotgun blasts, and more screaming. Avery put a hand on Sylvia's shoulder.
"There's no one guarding the docks," she said. "We should get going."
Sylvia took the young woman's hand and squeezed it.
"She's right, Ben. Let's move while we have a chance."
Another shotgun blast from the edge of the market made them turn. Jimmy Hinton and his wife, who was wielding the shotgun, were running into the clearing. Though it wasn't really a run. Both husband and wife were in their late 60s and overweight, and they advanced with an awkward, loping gait that looked terrifyingly slow compared to the soldiers chasing after them. Richardson saw one of the soldiers bring his rifle up to his shoulder and fire at the couple. Little umbrellas of dirt exploded around Hinton's feet, and he raised his arms and wobbled like a man trying to stay balanced on a high wire. Gabby Hinton turned and jammed the stock of her shotgun into her belly and fired twice at the advancing soldiers. One of the soldiers dropped to his knees, holding his side. Then she turned and ran after her husband, who was still gesturing to Richardson, to get onto the dock. Richardson ran up the short flight of stairs that led to the dock. 20 feet ahead of him, Sylvia, Avery, and Nate were face to face with a soldier. The man was barely Avery's age. Just a kid, really, who had his rifle leveled at them. The soldier looked frightened, almost like he was seasick. But when he saw Richardson charging up the stairs, he turned and fired at Richardson. The bullet whined through the air, narrowly missing his face. Richardson ducked behind a thick wooden pylon and drew his pistol. He gave a quick glance over his shoulder and saw that Jimmy and his wife had almost reached the dock. Then he looked back at Sylvia, Avery, and Nate, who had backed up to the edge of the dock, their hands in the air. The soldier was still standing in the middle of the gangway, the rifle down around his hips. His mouth was hanging open, and his eyes were darting back and forth between his prisoners and the pylon where Richardson was hiding. It looked like he couldn't make up his mind what to do. Richardson made it up for him. He stepped out from behind the pylon with his pistol in both hands, leveled it at the soldier's chest, and fired twice before the man could register what was happening. The soldier kept his feet, even after getting hit. He staggered back to the opposite edge of the dock, his hands hanging limply at his side, the rifle dropped and forgotten on the wooden planks. His face had an elastic, slack-jawed expression as he stared about him. He never cried out. He saw a wooden pylon and fell against it. There was a look of utter disbelief on his face as he sank down onto his butt. His eyes never closed. "David!" Avery shouted. The girl ran over to him and stopped, wanting to touch him, but unable to do so. Sylvia gave him a sad, pained look before grabbing Avery by the shoulders and pulling her toward the Sugar Jane.
"Good shot,"
Jimmy Hinton said from the top of the stairs.
"You seen the boat yet?"
"Huh?" Richardson said.
"No time like right now."
He turned to his wife.
"Gabby, you got this rifle?"
"Got it," she said, as she too crested the top of the stairs.
"Get the boat started."
"Yes, ma'am."
Gabby Hinton ran over to where the dead soldier's rifle lay on the dock and scooped it up. More soldiers were coming up the stairs. She turned the rifle on them and started firing in short, controlled bursts, aiming every shot, making them count.
"You got those rifles you promised me?"
Hinton said to Richardson.
"Now's the time to prove they work."
The world seemed to be swirling around Richardson, going too fast. Feeling dizzy, he took one of the AR-15s from his pack and started firing at the soldiers who were running toward them from the market. From where they were firing, he and Gabby had both cover and concealment behind the heavy dock timbers, while the soldiers had to cross nearly 30 yards of open concrete slab. They were sitting ducks down there.
"I'm out,"
Gabby said to him.
Go to the boat. I can cover us.
"We'll need at least 2 minutes to get the boat loose from the dock."
I got it, he said. Go.
Gabby slung the rifle over her shoulder and waddled down the length of the dock. Richardson watched her go, then turned back to the concrete slab between the dock and the market. Nearly all the vendors had fled. Here and there he saw carts overturned, their contents spilled on the ground. Dead soldiers were everywhere. Here and there he saw a few dead vendors and their animals. The soldiers had taken up cover and concealment at the edges of the market. He could see their gray shirts and black pants moving in the shadows. He fired whenever he had a chance, then stopped to reload. He ejected the empty magazine, slapped in another one, and brought the rifle back up. It had taken him less than 5 seconds, but in that time 2 of the soldiers had sprinted from their hiding places to an overturned vegetable cart off to his left. They're trying to flank me, he realized. Draw me out. He could see their feet under the cart, and that was enough. What he knew of fighting he'd learned from Ed Moore, the retired U.S. Deputy Marshal who had helped Richardson and a handful of others escape Jasper Sewell's compound years before. And he could almost hear the old marshal's voice in his ears, reminding him that, when it came to gunfights, there was no such thing as cover. You could conceal yourself, but you couldn't ever cover yourself. That was a myth. Damn right, he muttered, as he centered the rifle's sights on the vegetable cart and started to fire. The bullets cut through the cart like a chainsaw, filling the air with splinters of wood and bits of vegetables. And when the dust settled, the cart was in 4 large pieces, dripping with the remains of pureed vegetables. The 2 soldiers lay dead on the concrete behind it. From behind him, he heard the Sugar Jane's engines coughing and spluttering to life. Sylvia was calling his name. He fired at the few gray shirts he could see moving in the shadows. Then he turned and ran for the boat. It was already pulling away as he reached the end of the dock. Sylvia and Gabby Hinton were motioning to him to hurry up. "Hurry, Ben!" Sylvia shouted. He heard more yelling behind him, and the sound of running footsteps on the wooden pier. Richardson glanced over his shoulder and saw a handful of soldiers coming up the stairs. Jimmy was right beside him. "Let's go," he said. Suddenly, Gabby popped up behind Sylvia. She had something in her hand. "Get your head down!" Gabby yelled, and lobbed what looked like a green baseball over Richardson's head. A second later there was an explosion that knocked him off his feet. He looked behind him toward the market. The dock was in a shambles. Men were dead or dying. Burnt pieces of wood floated on the water. Smoke drifted on the breeze. There was a giant hole where the stairs had been. She threw a grenade, Richardson realized. Holy shit, that woman's nuts. But the shooting hadn't stopped. More of Stoller's men were emerging from the edge of the market, firing toward the Sugar Jane. "Hurry!" Gabby said. "Come on!" He ducked his head and jumped into Sylvia's open arms, the 2 of them crashing into a padded seat on the far side of the dock. A sharp pain went through his right shoulder, and he groaned. "Are you okay, Ben?" He opened his eyes. He was face to face with Sylvia, their noses only inches apart. Richardson nodded. "You did good back there. Thanks." He smiled and let out an exhausted sigh. "Yeah, you're welcome." They were powering away from the dock now, the diesels making a huge noise, but it still seemed to Richardson like they were creeping along. He licked his lips, all at once aware of just how close he was to Sylvia. He didn't look away. He could hear her breathing and see the sparkling drops of river water in her hair. "You still want me to cut it?" she asked. He was about to laugh when he heard sobbing behind him. Frowning, he rolled over and saw Avery Harper with her face pressed into Nate Royal's chest. Nate seemed at a complete loss as to what to do with the crying girl, and as he put his hands on her back and slowly patted her shoulders, he looked like he'd just been handed more responsibility than he wanted to deal with. "Is she okay?" Richardson asked Sylvia. Sylvia shook her head.
"That boy you shot on the dock, that was a friend of hers."
"Oh, Christ," Richardson said. He gave the sobbing girl another glance. "Oh, Christ." He pulled himself up to a seated position on the gunwale and watched the Missouri coastline slip slowly away. Chapter 14. The truck lumbered to a stop. Rough hands pulled Nicky Booth from her seat and threw her to the ground. Even before she rose to her feet, she could smell the sour, sweet stink of putrescence in the air. She was wearing a burlap hood, and the stench of rotting bodies mingled with the heat of her breath and her own suffused terror. But her isolation under the hood was also a small blessing, for it gave her a chance to steady herself before she had to face the place she had only heard of in whispered rumors from the river Bedouins in Herculaneum. She felt a hand grip the top of the hood and yank it off. Nicky wheeled around on the soldier, but he had already stepped back out of range of her feet. Apparently, he had learned his lesson after the incident the night before, when they agreed to uncuff her so she could go to the bathroom. Two of the guards, she saw, still had nasty bruises on their faces where she had kicked them. But her anger evaporated when she saw what lay before her. And despite her best efforts to look like she could handle herself come hell or high water, she couldn't help but gasp. She was standing on a gravel road that led down to the dock at the riverside. A forest of heavy stakes. There were 200, maybe more, rose up on either side of the road. Most were topped with the naked bodies of dead men who had been impaled through the rectum and allowed to slide down the spikes. Each body had its hands and feet bound together, their mouths hanging open in eternal screams. Some had been burned from the feet up, the ground around them blackened by the fire. Others had been partially eaten by the infected. The air swarmed with black crows and flies. There were more of the loathsome birds roosting on the impaled bodies, while still others fought over scraps of rotten flesh on the ground. The smell was enough to make the bile rise to the back of her mouth, but she managed to keep it down. And somehow she was able to maintain that control, right up to the point where she saw the mouth of one of the men on a stake near her start to move. One look at the man's eyes, and she knew he was still conscious, aware of every bit of the hell he was experiencing. At that point, Nicky doubled over and vomited. When she looked up again, she saw one of the guards watching her, smiling, like he was enjoying her suffering.
"What's wrong with you?" she said. "These are men. You're a man. How could you do this?"
The smile left his face. Behind her, she heard a chorus of moans. She turned and saw Lauren Skaggs leading an enormous troop of zombies toward them. Nicky began to back away, but one of the guards stepped close to her and grabbed her arm tightly. "It'd be a mistake," he said. "Stand still. Don't move." She looked at the man as she struggled to break his grip. He wouldn't let go. Lauren and his zombies were almost on them now, and she could smell them. Their moaning had blotted out everything, even the squawking of the crows.
"Hold her still,"
Lauren said, and the sound of his voice sent a chill through her. She stopped struggling and watched him as he passed, the red flesh on his bald head glistening like a puddle of oil.
"Bring her over with us on the ferry,"
Lauren said to the guard.
"Yes, sir."
And with that, Lauren walked on down to the river and the waiting ferry, his zombies following behind like a congregation headed for baptism. They passed on either side of Nicky, so close she could have reached out and touched them had her hands not been cuffed behind her back.
Let me go,
she pleaded to the guard.
Stand still, girl. Don't you move, or we'll both die.
Please,
she said. She heard the whining in her voice, but she didn't care. She felt utterly defenseless, and more terrified than she had been since her father died, leaving her to fend for herself and for Avery in the wilds of a blasted landscape. Her skin was crawling, the goose flesh rising on her arms and neck. She was holding her breath, trying not to scream.
Easy,
the guard holding her arm said. Almost through them. A zombie, a woman in her late 50s, passed just inches from her. The zombie turned to look at Nikki as she staggered by. Her face was covered with boils and abscesses, and swarming with flies that probed her sores and the oozing fluid at the corners of her milky white eyes. Unable to stand it anymore, Nikki squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't stop trembling. When the zombies were loaded onto the ferry, 2 guards led Nikki aboard. The guards put her in a chair in the back of the boat, and she didn't resist. In front of her, the zombies swayed with the motion of the boat. Lauren Skaggs stood at the head of the ferry, looking off toward the crumbling ruins of the Kirkman Hyatt and Convention Center on the opposite bank. The 2 guards pulled on the guide rope that connected the 2 sides of the river, and slowly the ferry inched its way across, the only sounds the creaking of the ropes and the squawking birds behind them. Before her, silhouetted by the setting sun, was the hotel that Lauren had turned into his own private hell on earth. Nikki watched as it grew closer, and a feeling of deep despair washed over her. Into the land of the dead, she thought. Flanked by guards, with zombies in front of and behind her, Nikki Booth was led up a concrete ramp to the ruins of what had once been the loading dock for the convention center portion of the hotel. The building was falling apart now. Everywhere she looked, she saw broken windows. The floors were covered with mud and leaves and trash, the walls spray-painted with fading graffiti. But there was no furniture, no equipment, no signs that an army was using this place as its headquarters. It took her a moment to notice that. All she felt walking into the facility was a distinct sense that something was off about it. And then a soldier ordered her to stop, and his voice echoed inside the 2-story-high emptiness of the loading dock, and it hit her. There's nothing here. No signs of occupation. What is this place? She said. No one answered her, and she knew she'd made a mistake. Don't show them you're afraid, kiddo. Keep 'em guessing about you. She sensed the guards behind her had stopped, and she tried to turn around. Somebody hit her in the shoulder. Don't turn around, one of the guards said. Come a little closer and say that. A different man spoke, this one older, and a smoker, Nikki guessed. His voice sounded like gravel. You heard the lady. Uncuff her. Nikki tensed. So they wanted to have some fun with her, eh? Well, bring it, assholes. One of the guards grabbed her handcuffs and worked the key into the hole. He was a bundle of nerves. She could feel it in the way his hands fumbled with the key and hear it in his breathing. Nikki curled her fingertips up into the man's palm and smiled when he jumped. But she didn't move. She just waited for him to come back, and when he did, she curled her fingertips into his palm again and gently stroked the length of his index finger, purring under her breath as the muscles in his finger relaxed. She heard him swallow, and then one of the cuffs fell away. It was the break she was waiting for. She slammed her elbow back into the guard's face and felt the satisfying crunch of the bridge of his nose. Blood gushed from the man's face. He bent forward, screaming, his hands over his nose. Nikki raised her boot and brought it down hard on the side of the man's knee, breaking it. He sank to